right, I am back with a new video, this time about some EA nonsense. Rather than doing more Destiny Heresy stuff, I'll keep doing that later, but I had to comment on this because it's one of the most insane takes I think I've ever seen, and like that's saying something, at least of the past year. This was something that I said House last time, Andrew Wilson said. Andrew Wilson is the CEO of EA. He was commenting on the fact that Dragon Age, the Veilguard, underperformed. Previously, we knew that EA said it had half of the quote-unquote engagements that they wanted to see, 1.5 million instead of 3 million. Those are not sales because engagements are not sales. That includes potentially players on EA Play, things like that. That's bad. That's very bad, especially for a sequel to a game that was Game of the Year a decade ago. You would think it would be very anticipated, and not enough people were interested. In talking about the game's failure, he had a specific idea of why it was, and I'll just read his quote here. This was on an investor call, of course. In order to break out beyond the core audience, games need to directly connect to the evolving demands of players who increasingly seek shared world features and deeper engagement along high-quality narratives in this beloved category. Dragon Age had a high-quality launch and was well reviewed by critics and those who played. However, it did not resonate with a broad audience in this highly competitive market. So what he's saying here is like critics liked it, people who played it liked it, but it did not have broader appeal because it did not have shared world features, or, you know, the other half of that is live service features. And he's right in the sense that it did review pretty well. Like, everyone yells at me about my 8.5, but it had an 82 from critics. On actual user reviews on Steam, it had like a 70 something percent. I am convinced the majority of the people yelling the loudest about this game have not actually played it. But it's certainly, you know, probably not as good as the older games. It has, you know, many things that can be considered disappointing for many players, and I understand that, but everyone can come together and agree that the problem with Dragon Age: The Veilguard is not that it was not a shared world or a live service. And if you've been following the saga for any length of time, I think it was Jason Schreier who reported back in the day that this project had been rebooted a bunch of times over the past decade, and one of those times was an EA mandate that they wanted to put live service aspects into the game. What exactly that means is not super clear. How this would have played out with co-op multiplayer or a hub world or PvP, I have no real idea because it doesn't make any sense in relation to the past of this series. BioWare apparently convinced EA to not do this because it was insane, but now that the game is launched and failed, EA is like, well, we told you to do live service, and clearly that would have been the broader appeal to you know, the non-mainstream or the mainstream audience that you did not get with this release. So the missing piece clearly was that it was not an online shared world live service. Nobody agrees with this. I've written about this and seen a bunch of articles on this. I have not seen one comment being like, yes, that's true. Oh, I wish it was multiplayer. And like, if you thought things were like bad on the current version of the game, what would be improved by also putting in multiplayer there if you didn't like the existing stuff that was in there? And I do think there's some awkwardness kind of left over from the game beat for, you know, the original multiplayer live service stuff they had in there, and they kind of had to rebuild it around that in some ways, which can kind of feel awkward. I think there are many reasons that the Veilguard failed, where you have some core Dragon Age fans, at least, who either moved on after 10 years or it came back. It was a different aesthetic. It was a different tone, different gameplay to some extent. Like, Dragon Age is sort of known for reinventing itself, but this may have been too much for some players. You know, I'd say the group of people that I see like the game the most are Dragon Age players, because there's a lot of like really interesting lore and story stuff from that perspective. I fully understand the second group of people, which are people who never played Dragon Age, and this is a direct sequel to a game that came out 10 years ago in, you know, a package that didn't look, you know, that interesting. And you do have to know at least something about Dragon Age to like kind of really get your head around it. And so I just see generally how that may not be appealing to uninitiated Dragon Age fans. Then there's, at some part of here, the anti-woke, people yelling about I don't even remember what people are mad about now. Characters non-binary. Is there anything else? I don't remember. But that was just online noise, and yet it can consume certain ecosystem chambers if that's all that's being debated. Even that group, like as much as they hated the game, like no one would agree that the problem here was a lack of multiplayer and live service. The problem is that this is not just like a stupid quote from Andrew Wilson, because it could potentially have a direct impact on Mass Effect 5. And we know this is what BioWare is working on in full now. And by in full, I mean after they transferred a bunch of people to EA and laid a bunch of people from Dragon Age off, because they're not in the best of shape right now. We don't really know much about Mass Effect 5 other than it's going back to the old universe. Or the old galaxy. We've gotten a few teasers. We do not have a release date. I don't think we have a release year even. So when that gets here is unclear. We had game director Michael Gamble saying that it will be something like true to Mass Effect or something. And this was kind of in the wake of Dragon Age changed too much in aesthetic and tone. I feel like he was kind of pushing back against that. But now the question is EA just going to let them make a normal Mass Effect single player game? Or are they going to be like, see, we told you so with Dragon Age, and like now we're going to say you put live stuff in this and you better do it, and you don't have a choice this time, even though BioWare, I'm sure, would know that this is what nobody wants. I don't even really understand how you would do this in the main campaign of a game like this. I guess you could have like people play co-op as your squad members or something. I said in my article, like I'm picturing a bunch of like different shepherds running around the Citadel as like a shared Destiny tower space or something. Like it doesn't really make sense. So the only thing I can think of is some sort of modification on the old multiplayer systems where it was it Andromeda and 3 that had multiplayer is like the main thing, where it was a separate mode. This was back when like a lot of games were trying to do multiplayer, but it was a separate mode that was just, it sort of existed. Whereas now, if you would have a separate multiplayer mode, you don't just want that. You want a seasonal multiplayer mode where you're going to have a battle pass and you're going to have cosmetics and you're going to have new content every 3 months and like all, operators and whatever they call the hero people, you're going to have that sort of thing. And so if they are going to do something live servicey here, I feel like it would be that. Of course, that would siphon away resources from building the main game, and allegedly there are only less than 100 workers at BioWare now after all these layoffs and departures. So, if you are doing some sort of live aspect, even if it is detached from the main campaign, how many people are you siphoning off the main project to start building out post-launch live content? Again, none of this has been announced. Like, we don't have a guarantee that this is going to happen with Mass Effect, but like them saying this out loud, them saying, well, Dragon Age needed to be a shared world, and that's why it didn't resonate, like all these buzzwords. But it's hard to think that if that is their true belief, that they would let Mass Effect sort of exist on its own and just, avoid this concept entirely. I do feel like it will probably be mandated and it will have some sort of live aspect to it. I think best case, it's what I said, where it's just some sort of addition to the multiplayer that goes on over time. If you really want to invest in that long term, I guess. Maybe they do PvP somehow. It doesn't seem fun. And leaving the main campaign alone. Worst case is like them somehow trying to integrate live service, ongoing story chapters and, co-op, like all of that stuff into the main campaign. That is like worst case scenario in which you'd be really going against the core of the system. And I think that would be a disaster. So just nonsense here. And this reminds me of something Warner Brothers said last year, where they were talking about, their games division lost hundreds of millions of dollars last year, and then it was down compared to the year before. And they said that they were doubling down on live service games because they believe live service games are the future. The context of this, of course, is that Hogwarts Legacy, a single player game with no live aspects at all, sold 20 million copies. I think it's 25 or 30 million now. Was the best selling game of that year, which never happens over like Call of Duty. And then Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League, lost $200 million and was one of the worst AAA launches ever. um, and, you could almost say it's worse than Concord in some ways because it took a studio that everyone liked, that everyone knew and wanted a new superhero game from, and they made something that nobody wanted, that nobody played, because not all the way, but in part because it was a live service. And like, I don't think the Suicide Squad concept in the first place would have existed if they weren't trying to be a looter shooter. Because like, how else, you're not gonna have a Justice League looter shooter with Superman walking around holding gun. Like, it barely worked as it was, but the fact that they were leaning into live service allowed for that game to exist in the first place. The point is it did terribly, and yet they're still leaning into the concept. So EA is not even alone in this, and Warner Brothers is saying something just as insane, especially when they had a clear success in the other direction, and the industry as a whole. How many games do we need to point out that are almost entirely dedicated single player games that do not have any live aspects that are massive hits? Not just Game of the Year winners, but like huge sellers. This endless pursuit of live service stuff. Like, I get that you want ongoing revenue, but how much are you losing in pursuit of that? How many failed projects do you need to, be more of a loss than just one single player game that may not sell quite as much as you want it to? You know what I mean? Like, it's a frustrating situation. And like, I don't think this can go on forever. I don't think you can keep trying to make 10 live service games and having like 1.5 maybe go okay, which is sort of what we're seeing. And, good luck, EA. You have larger problems, I think. People are not playing or not liking FC 2025, which is a bigger issue for them, given that sports stuff is their real moneymaker. But I don't know enough about that to comment on that. So if anyone else wants to explain why that's so bad now, let me know. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.